Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is one of those rare films that stays with you long after the credits roll. It's a story where reality and madness blur, and where you're never quite sure if what you're seeing is real or just a reflection of the characters' unraveling minds. On the surface, it portrays a family trapped in a creepy hotel through the winter, but underneath, there's a sense that something more is at play, in which every action and line of dialogue feels loaded with meaning. For some, it's a straight-up ghost story, with the Overlook taking control of its caretaker and turning him into a killer. For others, it's a far more psychological tale. A man slowly losing his mind, consumed by his own failures and addictions. Which brings us to the key question at the heart of the film. What was Kubrick actually trying to convey? Is The Shining about spiritual possession, or the slow collapse of a man's sanity? Or perhaps both, a fusion of the supernatural and the psychological, each feeding the other until reality itself becomes uncertain. While the Overlook Hotel might seem undeniably haunted, another reading emerges when you strip away the surface horror, one where the ghosts are less spirits than projections of the characters' fractured psyches. In this light, the hotel's threats are not merely external, they reflect the darkness within. In the Gold Room, Jack appears to be speaking to the ghost of a bartender who once worked at the hotel. Yet, given the contempt he holds against Wendy and Danny, Lloyd could just as easily be considered a mental construct, a comforting illusion Jack conjures to justify his drinking and vent his anger. The same reasoning applies to the former caretaker Jack encounters in the bathroom. Rather than a literal ghost, Grady may be another projection, a voice inside Jack's mind rationalizing murder. He becomes the figure who tells Jack exactly what he wants to hear, reinforcing his violent impulses. Then there's Danny's vision of the twin girls, which many interpret as the ghosts of Grady's daughters haunting the Overlook's corridors. But the fact that Danny glimpses them even before arriving at the hotel suggests another possibility. Could they be nothing more than images of a past tragedy, shown to him by Tony as a precognitive warning of his father's violent tendencies? Seen this way, The Shining is less about a haunted hotel and more about haunted people. Where a strictly psychological interpretation of the film begins to falter is at the end of the second act, when Jack is freed from the food pantry. Of course, one could speculate that Danny's shine includes telekinesis, allowing him to open the door with his mind, though his only conceivable motive would be a desperate attempt to kill his father before Jack could harm him or Wendy. While it's theoretically plausible to read the scene that way, especially since the shot of Grady opening the pantry door was cut before the film's release, it makes far more sense from a narrative standpoint to keep Jack locked away, where he can do no harm. And how do we account for Wendy's encounters with the hotel's apparitions without invoking a spectral presence? One could argue that Danny is telepathically projecting images into his mother's mind via the shine, a sort of physical manifestation of the terror he experiences while being stalked by his father. But this would be an even bigger reach than Danny unlocking the pantry door. So, while it is possible to interpret much of the Overlook's ghostly activity as psychological projection, there are moments where this explanation strains credibility. Moments unlike those in another movie that plays out in a similar fashion, and that's Jack Clayton's 1961 film, The Innocents. Based on Henry James's Gothic novella, The Turn of the Screw, The Innocents tells the story of a psychologically fragile woman who becomes the governess for two orphaned children living at Bly Manor, an English country house. As the plot develops, we are led to believe that the manor is haunted by the spirits of the children's previous governess and her lover, and that these spirits might be possessing the children. Yet by the end of the film, it remains unclear whether the apparitions are real or simply the product of the governess's troubled mind. Every scene is carefully constructed to preserve this ambiguity, leaving viewers unsure of what was real and what was imagined. While Kubrick employs a similar approach throughout the first two acts of The Shining, prompting the audience to question the nature of the Overlook's apparitions, the ambiguity evaporates the moment Jack is freed from the pantry, a shift that was entirely deliberate. In a 1980 interview with film critic Michel Simon, Kubrick explained why he found this aspect of Stephen King's novels striking. It seemed to strike an extraordinary balance between the psychological and the supernatural in such a way as to lead you to think that the supernatural would eventually be explained by the psychological. Jack must be imagining these things because he's crazy. This allowed you to suspend your doubt of the supernatural until you were so thoroughly into the story that you could accept it almost without noticing. As the supernatural events occurred, you searched for an explanation, and the most likely one seemed to be that the strange things happening would finally be explained as the products of Jack's imagination. It's not until Grady, the ghost of the former caretaker who axed his family to death, slides open the bolt of the larder door, allowing Jack to escape, that you are left with no other explanation but the supernatural. If the Overlook is truly meant to hold a supernatural force, then what exactly is the source of that power, and why is it so intent on destroying the Torrances? To answer that, we first need to recognize that the hotel isn't actually haunted, at least not in the way we might assume. In Stephen King's novel, the supernatural elements are presented far more explicitly. The Overlook Hotel is revealed to have a long and violent history, a place steeped in death and corruption. While tending the boiler in the basement, Jack discovers an old scrapbook stuffed with newspaper clippings and faded photographs documenting the hotel's sinister past. Through it, we learn that the Overlook was once a magnet for organized crime, a meeting place for the mafia, and the site of countless grisly events, gangland-style executions, a drunk student falling from a window, a senator dying of a heart attack, a man dropping dead from a stroke. The building seems to absorb these horrors, its walls quietly collecting the impressions of every cruel and tragic act committed within them. When the Torrances arrive, Halloran explains to Danny that all the bad things that have ever happened at the hotel have left traces behind, almost like fingernail clippings, and that they're nothing more than harmless images, like pictures in a book. Later, when Wendy asks Jack whether he believes in ghosts, he says that if anything does exist at the Overlook, it's not ghosts exactly, but emotional residues, the leftover feelings of the people who once stayed there. But Danny is different. Halloran tells him that of everyone he's ever met with the Shine, Danny's ability is by far the strongest, and it's that strength, that immense psychic power, that reawakens the Overlook's dark history. Danny's presence stirs the lingering energy of the place, bringing its pictures to life, transforming them from passive echoes into something physically tangible and dangerously real. And the longer Danny remains at the hotel, the stronger that force becomes. The novel makes it clear that these residual traces, the psychic leftovers from decades of death and despair, gradually merge into a single entity, a kind of sentient evil shaped by the hotel's collective suffering. And because Danny is the one feeding this dark intelligence, the only way for the Overlook to preserve itself is to kill him, to consume his psychic energy and ensure its own survival. King describes this through Wendy's own realization late in the story. She thought that Danny might be the one the hotel really wanted, the reason it was going so far, maybe the reason it was able to go so far. It might even be that in some unknown fashion it was Danny's shine that was powering it, the way a battery powers the electrical equipment in a car, the way a battery gets a car to start. If they got out of here, the Overlook might subside to its old semi-sentient state, able to do no more than present penny dreadful horror slides to the more psychically aware guests who entered it. Without Danny, it was not much more than an amusement park haunted house, where a guest or two might hear rappings or the phantom sounds of a masquerade party, or see an occasional disturbing thing. Danny is the key to the Overlook's power. His shine doesn't just perceive the supernatural, it fuels it. King even illustrates this idea symbolically when Danny inserts a silver key into the ballroom clock and winds it, a direct metaphor for him energizing the hotel. And once the Overlook awakens, it uses the psychic residue of past tragedies as its puppets, ghostly impressions it manipulates in an effort to absorb Danny's shine into its walls. The apparitions the Torrances encounter aren't conscious spirits with their own will, but echoes given form and purpose by the hotel itself. Another intriguing aspect of Kubrick's version of The Shining is the subtle but persistent Native American motif. After Ullman shows the Torrances the hedge maze, he casually mentions that the hotel was built on an Indian burial ground, a line absent from King's novel, hinting at a possible origin for the Overlook's dark history. Kubrick conceived the idea of the native burial site while reading the chapter in King's manuscript, where Jack discovers the scrapbook. He saw it as a fitting explanation for the hotel's many deaths, a curse laid upon desecrated sacred ground. This jinx was meant to drive repeated acts of violence throughout the Overlook's history, which, over time, accumulate into a pool of negative energy that becomes sentient once Danny arrives. Novelist Diane Johnson, who co-wrote the screenplay, confirmed Kubrick's intent. That was his attitude. If you're going to have the supernatural, there had to be an explanation for it. He wanted everything founded on some sort of reality or plausibility, even if it was magic. The Native American motif also influenced Kubrick's choice of the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite National Park as a model for the Overlook's interior. Its decor featuring native designs throughout reinforced his idea of an Indian curse at the heart of the hotel's malevolence. The motif also adds a subtle but unmistakable layer of social commentary. The Overlook is, in many ways, a monument to American excess, a grand resort carved into the Colorado mountains, where the rich and famous come to indulge in luxury. Yet it literally rests on the graves of those whose land was taken to build it. In this sense, the hotel becomes a metaphor for the foundation of American wealth and privilege itself, a structure built upon centuries of exploitation and erasure. Furthermore, Kubrick may also be expanding on an idea Stephen King hints at in the novel. In a scene where Danny lies awake, disturbed by the strange influence the Overlook seems to exert over his family, he senses that something is wrong, though he cannot fully grasp what it is. To describe this feeling, Danny recalls a series of pictures captioned, "Can you see the Indians?" Hidden image illustrations in which shapes of Native Americans emerge from an otherwise ordinary landscape if one stared long enough. King writes, "If you strained and squinted, you could see some of them. The thing you had taken for a cactus at first glance was really a brave with a knife clamped in his teeth, and there were others hiding in the rocks. But you could never see all of them, and that was what made you uneasy. Because it was the ones you couldn't see that would sneak up behind you, a tomahawk in one hand and a scalping knife in the other." For Danny, these images symbolize the Overlook itself. On the surface, the hotel appears ordinary, even inviting, but there is something buried within it, something glimpsed only if you look the right way. The Overlook's presence is like those hidden figures, partly visible, always lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. Could the can of Calumet baking powder resting on the pantry shelf behind Halloran be a visual echo of King's "Can you see the Indians" illustrations? A subtle nod to a hidden motif, noticeable only to those paying close attention? Regardless of whether one accepts Kubrick's Indian curse as the source of the Overlook's spiritual sickness, its influence over Jack Torrance remains the story's central concern. What exactly is the hotel doing to him, and how does it transform him into a homicidal madman? This aspect of the film can be read in several ways, but the key to understanding Kubrick's approach lies in the single most important change he made when adapting King's novel for the screen: Jack's relationship with his family. In King's novel, Jack Torrance is a man defined by both love and guilt. He genuinely adores his wife and son, and it is precisely that love that makes his downfall so tragic. He is a deeply flawed individual, striving to rebuild his life after years of anger, alcoholism, and failure. He wants to be better. He wants to be a good husband and father, and when he hurts them, he despairs at himself for doing so. When Jack breaks Danny's arm after coming home drunk, King writes that Jack saw the hatred in Wendy's eyes and felt staggered by it, all alone. This was what oncoming death felt like. This passage captures the essence of Jack, a man painfully aware of his own weakness, crushed by the fear of losing the only people who still believe in him. His love for his family becomes the fragile thread that keeps him from giving in to the Overlook's influence. But in Kubrick's film, that thread doesn't exist. The Jack we meet on screen doesn't love his family. He resents them. Even before the Torrances arrive at the hotel, the distance is obvious. When Jack calls Wendy to say he's accepted the caretaker job, his voice carries a cold, dismissive edge, as if talking to her is a chore. And on the long drive to the Overlook, it's clear he doesn't enjoy being confined in a car with his wife and son for 3.5 hours. From the outset, Kubrick presents Jack as a man who sees his family not as a source of strength, but as a burden. Obligations that weigh him down and keep him from the life he believes he deserves. Where King's Jack draws motivation and purpose from Wendy and Danny, Kubrick's Jack treats them as obstacles, quietly holding them responsible for his disappointments. Even co-screenwriter Diane Johnson has said, "The underlying story of The Shining is of a father's hate for his child and wife. The murderous father is a very, very frightening archetype, one that's not much used." In the novel, Jack and Danny share a genuine closeness. They spend time together, express affection openly, and understand each other in a way that even Wendy sometimes envies. Their bond is so strong that she occasionally feels shut out, wishing she could connect with Danny the way Jack does. In the film, however, that warmth is completely absent. Wendy is the one who spends time with Danny, exploring the hedge maze, playing in the snow, while Jack isolates himself. Aside from the scene where Danny quietly asks permission to get his fire truck, father and son are rarely together at all. And even in that brief moment, Danny's fear around his father is unmistakable. Moreover, Kubrick's Jack shows open contempt for Wendy, not only in the Colorado Lounge confrontation, but especially when she suggests they leave the hotel for Danny's safety. In that moment, he unleashes a wave of hostility, belittling her, accusing her of sabotaging him, and twisting her concern for their son into a selfish affront. His priorities are entirely self-centered. Danny's well-being doesn't factor into his thinking at all. What matters to Jack is that Wendy is obstructing what he wants, and he responds with anger rather than the slightest flicker of empathy. In the novel, this scene is handled with far more nuance. Jack's tone is softer and more measured, acknowledging the difficulty of getting Danny down to Sidewinder during the storm. He shifts into problem-solving mode, quickly formulating a plan to get Danny out safely using the snowmobile. And even when the hotel intrudes on his thoughts with flashes of violence, brief urges to harm Wendy, his love for his family gives him the strength to resist. Danny's safety remains his highest priority, and he actively fights to keep control of himself. That concern carries into the shed scene, where Jack tries to repair the snowmobile. For a moment, he considers sabotaging it, fully aware that it's their only means of escape. But then the consequences catch up to him, and he pulls back. Even though leaving the Overlook would send him back to the unemployment line, he knows that staying would put Danny in mortal danger. In contrast, Kubrick's Jack feels none of this conflict. He acts entirely in service of his own desires, brushing aside both Wendy and Danny without a second thought. This divergence in Jack's personality between novel and film dramatically changes how the Overlook exerts its control over him. In King's novel, Jack's love for his family creates genuine resistance to the hotel's influence. The Overlook must push hard to break him, and it only gains full control when it finally overwhelms his mind. By the climax, the hotel doesn't merely manipulate Jack, it inhabits him completely. His body turns monstrous, his eyes glow, and even after Wendy drives a knife into his back, he keeps coming after her and Danny with unstoppable force. When Danny shouts, "You're it, not my daddy, you're the hotel," it's literal. The evil must physically become Jack before it can use him. In the film, no such takeover is required. Jack's hatred is already simmering beneath the surface. The hotel simply grants him license to act on it by suppressing what little moral restraint remains. As Kubrick explained in his interview with Michel Simon, Jack comes to the hotel psychologically prepared to do its murderous bidding. He doesn't have very much further to go for his anger and frustration to become completely uncontrollable. He is bitter about his failure as a writer. He is married to a woman for whom he has only contempt. He hates his son. In the hotel, at the mercy of its powerful evil, he is quickly ready to fulfill his dark role. Kubrick's decision to transform Jack Torrance from a loving family man to a self-serving malcontent shifts the premise of The Shining toward a fundamentally different narrative. In his book, The Art of Dramatic Writing, Hungarian playwright Lajos Egri defines a story's premise as its central idea, the moral truth the drama must prove through action. Each premise, he explains, contains character, conflict, and resolution, all implied within a single concise statement. For Shakespeare's Macbeth, Egri identifies the premise as ruthless ambition leads to its own destruction. Macbeth's lust for power defines his character. His crimes form the conflict, and his downfall serves as the resolution that fulfills the story's moral argument. Applied to Kubrick's version of The Shining, Egri's premise for Macbeth fits like a glove. Jack is driven by ego and ambition, desperate for success, yet blaming everyone else for his failures. His willingness to murder his own family for standing in his way ultimately leads to his demise. In this light, the moral truth of ruthless ambition leads to its own destruction translates seamlessly to Kubrick's film. King's novel, however, rests on a very different emotional foundation. His Jack Torrance is a man who genuinely cares for his family, but cannot escape the cycle of his own flaws. His final act of self-sacrifice, saving Danny from the hotel's wrath, turns his tragedy into a moment of redemption. The premise of King's story then could be expressed as selfless love defies corruption. Though the movie and novel share a similar plot, at their core they tell two very different stories, one about unchecked ambition, the other about the enduring bond between father and son. This likely explains why Kubrick removed Jack's redemption arc. There is nothing in his version of the character to redeem. Jack's downfall isn't the loss of a good man to evil forces, but the inevitable collapse of a self-absorbed figure, consumed by his hunger for validation. The Overlook doesn't corrupt him, it merely amplifies what's already there. Understanding this fundamental shift in premise is key to interpreting the movie. Taking everything discussed so far into account, I would now like to present my subjective take on Kubrick's version of The Shining, my preferred way of filling in the gaps and interpreting the narrative. That being said, this isn't intended as a definitive analysis, nor do I mean to suggest there's only one correct way to understand the film. Part of what makes movies like The Shining so compelling is their ambiguity. The deliberate gaps, subtle cues, and contradictions woven into the plot invite multiple interpretations. Ambiguity lets viewers engage with the story on their own terms, finding meaning in its events and imagery in a way that resonates personally. My analysis is guided by three main criteria: the changes Kubrick made in adapting King's novel for the screen, narrative elements from the novel not included in the film yet remain compatible with its restructured form, as well as interviews and production notes from Kubrick and his crew when making the film. Using this framework, I'll explore the film from beginning to end, keeping in mind that multiple readings can coexist, whether or not they were the filmmaker's intention. From its very first shots, The Shining wastes no time establishing tone and structure, vast landscapes, unsettling music, and a sense that something is already wrong. Yet beneath that surface, the story begins deceptively ordinarily. Much of the action and dialogue unfolds in a fairly straightforward manner. Jack arrives at the hotel for his job interview, and we're introduced to Wendy and Danny in their Boulder apartment. There are, of course, a number of small, Easter egg-like details to notice, such as the Goofy doll in Danny's room, whose clothes strikingly resemble Wendy's outfit, or Ullman referring to the former caretaker as Charles Grady, when Grady later claims his first name is Delbert. But in terms of the narrative through-line, much of Act 1 serves as straightforward exposition and world-building. One detail worth noting occurs during Jack's interview, when Ullman recounts the Grady tragedy. In the novel, Grady tells Jack that the two of them were hired by the same manager, the Overlook itself, not Ullman, implying that Grady's murderous rampage, like Jack's eventual descent, is a direct result of the hotel's influence. Personally, I never cared for this explanation. If the Overlook truly drove Grady to murder his family, just as it later does with Jack, then why didn't the same thing happen with any of the other caretakers it employed? For the hotel to have influenced Grady to kill, one of the Gradys would have needed to possess a shine as powerful as Danny's, strong enough to awaken the hotel. But if that were the case, the Overlook would already have absorbed the shine after their deaths, leaving it with no need for Danny at all. Instead, I prefer to view Grady's murders as a tragic but ultimately human incident, the result of cabin fever, as Ullman suggests, and perhaps even a consequence of the Indian curse. Then, when Danny arrives, the Overlook awakens and uses its memory of Grady's rampage as a template, a blueprint for manipulating Jack into killing Danny so it can absorb his power. From the interview scene, the film transitions to Danny brushing his teeth in the bathroom, where Tony tries to warn him about the danger awaiting his family at the Overlook. When Danny asks why Tony doesn't want to go to the hotel, Tony shows him two visions: the Grady girls standing in the corridor, and an elevator releasing a torrent of blood. Both images foreshadow events to come, the sisters representing the Overlook's first attempt to communicate with Danny, beckoning him to come and play forever and ever, and the elevator of blood symbolizing the hotel's murderous force as it nears its point of full emergence, a stage King's novel refers to as the midnight hour. Tony also shows Danny a third image, himself screaming in terror as his father kills Halloran with the axe. Like the elevator of blood, it foreshadows the moment when the Overlook's violence has reached its peak. During the Torrance's tour of the Overlook, Danny is in the games room playing darts when he notices the Grady girls watching him with ominous eyes, a sign that the hotel has awakened and is curious to glimpse the young boy who has stirred it to life. The Overlook uses the image of the murdered sisters as its chosen form of communication, perhaps sensing that, of all the victims tied to its tragic history, they are the ones Danny is most likely to respond to. In his original script outline, prepared before Diane Johnson joined the project, Kubrick had Danny reacting to an Indian doll instead of the twins. The outline also featured the same doll in Tony's initial vision while Danny is brushing his teeth. Both instances were later changed to the Grady girls, perhaps because Kubrick felt the doll made the Native American motifs connection to the supernatural a little too obvious. Later that day, Halloran explains to Danny that any troubling images he sees during his stay at the hotel are merely traces of past horrors, echoes of events that cannot physically harm him. However, Danny's shine warns him that Halloran is particularly wary of room 237. This is, of course, the room where the corpse of a mysterious woman is seen floating in the bathtub. Because the film never identifies her, some viewers assume she is Grady's wife, and that room 237 is the Grady suite. But when Ullman shows the Torrances their quarters, he notes that only the staff wing of the hotel is heated during winter, suggesting the Grady family likely stayed in the same suite as the Torrances. An unused prop newspaper clipping produced for the movie identifies the woman from room 237 as Mary Fallico. In King's novel, the woman is Mrs. Massey, a frequent guest who committed suicide a few months before the Torrances arrive. The day after her body is removed, a chambermaid with the shine sees her ghostly image in the bathroom. Later, Halloran investigates and witnesses the same apparition, which explains his reluctance to tell Danny about the room. He fears that encountering such a horrifying vision could deeply traumatize a boy Danny's age. At this point in the story, the hotel hasn't yet gained enough power to cause physical harm, nor is Halloran aware that it ever could. His concern is purely for Danny's psychological safety, not his life. After the Torrances are shown around the hotel on closing day, the film jumps forward 1 month later, with Wendy bringing Jack breakfast in bed. Here, Jack tells her that he loves the hotel, saying he's never been happier or more comfortable anywhere. It's an important moment, the first clear sign that his stay at the Overlook is having a profound effect on his well-being. This scene marks another deviation from King's novel. In the book, Jack doesn't fall in love with the Overlook. He sees it pragmatically, as a steady job that might restore his reputation, support his family, and give him the quiet he needs to finish his play. To Jack, the hotel represents one last shot at redemption after a life damaged by alcoholism and violence. But, as time passes, he begins to question whether taking the position of winter caretaker was the right choice. King writes, "As he got behind the truck's wheel, it occurred to him that while he was fascinated by the Overlook, he didn't much like it. He wasn't sure it was good for either his wife or his son or himself." Only later, once the Overlook's influence fully takes hold, does Jack's love for the hotel emerge. And even then, it isn't genuine affection. It's a feeling implanted by the hotel itself. The Overlook convinces him that he's special, that he's the one it wants, not Danny. It's devotion manufactured through manipulation. Kubrick's Jack, on the other hand, is different. His love for the Overlook comes naturally. It's there from the very beginning. From the moment he arrives, he's enthralled by the place. The hotel gives him freedom. He's free from responsibility, free from judgment, and for the first time in years, he feels in control. The breakfast scene is the only moment in the film where we see Jack warm and affectionate toward Wendy, smiling, playful, relaxed. The pressures of the outside world have fallen away, and he's basking in the comfort the hotel provides. But Jack's affection for the Overlook isn't just about peace of mind. It's about aspiration and identity. Jack despises the ordinary life he actually has, yet he idolizes what the Overlook represents: status, power, and prestige. He's intoxicated by its grandeur, its gold ballroom, and the legacy of the distinguished guests who've stayed there. In his mind, the Overlook is a private club for the elite, and he desperately wants to be counted among them. This desire, more than anything, is what ultimately turns him against his family. His mousy wife and dysfunctional son remind him of the failure he's trying to escape, the ball and chain holding him back from the life he believes he deserves. Each day he spends in the Overlook only deepens that longing until the fantasy of joining the hotel's world of wealth and permanence completely replaces his grip on reality. Also during the breakfast scene, Jack tells Wendy that when he first came to the Overlook for his interview, it felt as though he'd been there before. The line is one of several moments in the film that seem to suggest that Jack has either been reincarnated or is, in some way, already woven into the hotel's past. Personally, I read Jack's words as nothing more than playful banter, a moment of light teasing with Wendy while in a relaxed state of mind rather than a cryptic revelation. Next, we see Jack loafing around the hotel while Wendy and Danny wander through the hedge maze. What's striking about this sequence is how Kubrick transitions between these separate events, allowing them to merge in the viewer's mind. When Jack peers down at the model of the maze, the film cuts to an exaggerated overhead shot of the real maze, showing Wendy and Danny at its center. The edit creates the eerie illusion that Jack is gazing down upon them, as if the camera itself reveals the quiet, controlling power he already exerts over his family. In truth, Jack is simply studying the model out of idle curiosity, nothing more than what any guest might do. But the way the images are arranged transforms this harmless act into something quietly sinister. The overhead shot of the maze overstates its scale far beyond reality, making Wendy and Danny appear small and lost within a vast labyrinth. It becomes a subtle yet potent symbol, a glimpse of the metaphorical maze they'll soon be forced to navigate as Jack's madness closes in around them. A few scenes later, Danny rides his trike through the long, empty corridors of the Overlook's second floor, his curiosity about room 237 finally getting the better of him. He slows, stops at the door, and tries the handle, just to see if it's unlocked. In King's novel, this moment is inspired by the French folktale Bluebeard. The story tells of a wealthy man who lives in a grand castle-like mansion. He marries a young woman and gives her the keys to every room in the house, but forbids her from entering one particular closet. When he leaves on a trip, curiosity begins to eat away at her. Days pass, and she finally gives in, unlocking the forbidden room where she discovers the hanging bodies of Bluebeard's previous wives. Upon his return, she must face the full wrath of his anger. Like the young woman in Bluebeard, Danny finds himself in a vast, mansion-like building, explicitly warned not to enter one particular room. But his curiosity, his need to know, overcomes that warning. When he finally steps into the forbidden space, he is met with a gruesome discovery: the decaying corpse of a woman in the bathtub, a figure who, much like Bluebeard's wives, stands as both a victim and a warning. After Danny tries the door, he again sees the image of the Grady girls that Tony showed him back in Boulder, suggesting a link between room 237 and the two sisters. When the Overlook first stirred to life on the day Danny arrived, it recognized his power and understood that, in order to remain alive, it would need to kill him and absorb his shine before the family's stay ended in the spring. So, when Danny tests the doorknob, the hotel becomes aware of his curiosity and seizes the opportunity. First, by using the girls as bait in the hallway, beckoning him to come and play. And then, while Danny plays with his toy cars outside room 237, by having the girls roll the tennis ball toward him to lure him inside, where it attacks using the lingering traces of Miss Fallico, the woman who took her own life in the bathtub. As an interesting side note, Danny's encounter with the girls while riding his trike through the corridors occurs only in the movie. Aside from Ullman briefly mentioning to Jack that Grady had 2 daughters, the girls never appear in King's novel. The scene is actually a fusion of 2 separate moments from the book: Danny seeing a blood-spattered wall in the presidential suite during the Torrance's tour of the hotel, and the Overlook calling out to Danny through the ghost of a young boy who died on the playground, asking him to come and play forever and ever. In Kubrick's film, the boy is replaced by the girls, and the blood-stained wall of the presidential suite, the result of a gangland murder, is transformed into the gruesome image of the murdered sisters. In an early draft of the script, Kubrick and Johnson had Danny's encounter with the girls take place in the hallway outside room 237, which made sense given that it's the room they ultimately lure him into. Johnson then suggested moving the scene to the top of the lobby staircase, reasoning that if Danny saw them outside room 237, he might be too frightened to enter the suite later. In the finished version, the encounter was ultimately staged in a different corridor altogether. It's also important to note that Kubrick never intended the Grady girls to be twins. Ullman tells Jack that they were 8 and 10 years old because, in the script, the children were written as being different ages. In fact, casting for the girls didn't take place until June of '78, about a month after the interview scene had already been filmed. Louise and Lisa Burns only attended the auditions for fun, fully aware that the producers weren't looking to cast twins. But the moment Kubrick saw their audition, he recognized that their eerie symmetry made them perfect for the roles. Their casting wasn't a deliberate attempt to portray twin ghosts, but an intuitive decision that ultimately shaped one of the film's most iconic images. While the Overlook works to lure Danny toward his demise, it also prepares a backup plan in case its primary strategy fails. If it cannot exploit the residual echo of one of its former victims, then perhaps it can manipulate one of his parents instead. And given Jack's evident discontent with his family, he becomes the ideal candidate, someone the hotel could easily push toward murder. In King's novel, the Overlook introduces itself to Jack through the scrapbook it leaves for him to discover. The moment he opens it marks the point when the hotel's influence begins to take hold. This event was originally included in Kubrick's film as well, though he ultimately removed it to maintain a greater sense of ambiguity. The next time we see Jack, after idling away in the Colorado lounge, he is suddenly at his desk, typing furiously following a month-long stretch of writer's block. This indicates that the hotel has finally introduced itself through the scrapbook, with its newspaper clippings inspiring him to base his new writing project on the Overlook's dark history, hence the sudden creative breakthrough. The scrapbook can even be seen sitting on his desk beside him. Although Wendy later discovers that Jack's manuscript contains nothing but the repeated line, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," he likely began by writing an actual book before descending into this obsessive repetition. Jack's newfound interest in the hotel's history marks the point at which the Overlook's influence begins. Its manipulation is subtle. It doesn't compel him to act so much as suppresses his inhibitions, allowing his buried hatred to surface unchecked. That's why, when Wendy enters the lounge to check on him, Jack lashes out with a level of hostility we haven't seen before. He berates her viciously, speaking without the slightest civility. The hotel is slowly stripping away his self-control, freeing him to express what he truly feels. J.W. Rinsler's 2024 book, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, an exhaustive chronicle of the film's production, includes co-screenwriter Diane Johnson's reflection on the symbolic function of Jack finding the scrapbook. That's when the herald takes the poison gift, or where Snow White eats the poison apple and the enchantment takes over. That's the way it was designed, though I thought it was more important than Stanley did. The scrapbook shows all the terrible things that have happened at the hotel. Murders, disgraces of various kinds, the massacre of the Indians. Everything terrible, but fascinating, and Jack is fascinated. It's where Jack puts himself in the power of the evil force that, from then on, will drive the action. In addition to altering Jack's personality, Kubrick significantly changed Wendy, transforming her from the strong, self-reliant woman of King's novel into a more mousy and vulnerable figure. Initially, he had planned to make her a tougher character, someone who could feed off Jack's flaws and failures, but later decided against it, explaining that he wanted Wendy to be someone who would realistically tolerate more abuse than the average person. In King's novel, Wendy's strength is supported by the reader's access to her internal thoughts, which reveal why she stays with Jack despite his explosive temper and alcoholism. She confronts him when possible, appeals to his better nature, and even threatens to leave if he doesn't seek help. Actions that make her decisions understandable and her eventual heroism believable. Translating this level of character depth to film, however, would have been challenging. Retaining Wendy's full novelistic complexity without the benefit of her internal perspective would leave the audience constantly questioning why she remains with Jack. Now that the hotel is actively suppressing Jack's conscience, his mind begins to simmer with thoughts of resentment as he watches his family outside, playing in the snow without a care in the world. It's here that Jack's first, half-formed ideas of killing Wendy and Danny begin to take shape. That's why we later find him sitting awake on the bed when Danny slips into the Torrance's quarters to fetch his fire truck. His head is racing, turning over plans and possibilities for how he might get away with murder. We've all heard real-world cases where someone stages a death to look accidental. Slow poisonings, hunting and boating mishaps, or carefully arranged alone time that ends fatally. The Torrance's enforced isolation for 5 months in the Colorado mountains provides Jack with a similar opportunity. Time, privacy, and an environment that could plausibly obscure a crime. He might imagine suffocating Wendy and Danny, dragging the bodies outside to make it appear they got lost in a storm and froze to death, or inventing an animal attack story. From a character perspective, it's entirely logical that he would be entertaining such ideas at this stage. The Overlook has begun loosening the restraints on his conscience, and now his imagination supplies the means to translate hatred into action. A mindset reflected at the end of the scene when Jack mockingly assures Danny that he loves him and would never do anything to hurt him. Alongside Stephen King's The Shining, Kubrick also considered adapting Diane Johnson's The Shadow Knows into a horror film. Ultimately, he chose King's novel and brought Johnson on to co-write the screenplay. Interestingly, The Shadow Knows features a short chapter that closely parallels the dynamic in Jack and Danny's bedroom scene, in which the story's protagonist contemplates killing her husband during a camping trip by pushing him into a gorge while he fishes. And, during The Shining's kitchen scene, when Wendy hears about the approaching snowstorm from a TV weather report, the news anchor mentions a woman who disappeared while on a hunting trip with her husband, a subtle detail that could serve as quiet foreshadowing of Jack's own murderous thoughts toward his family. A further, surprisingly coincidental parallel appears in an earlier Kubrick film, Lolita, which, like The Shining, also includes a scene of its main character, Humbert, in his bedroom wearing a robe, devising a plan to murder his wife and cover it up. Though the circumstances surrounding the two stories are unrelated, both films highlight Kubrick's fascination with the private, almost domestic spaces where a character's violent intentions quietly take shape. After the Overlook's failed attempt to kill Danny in room 237, it moves to its backup plan, using Jack as its weapon of choice. Drawing inspiration from Delbert Grady's axe-murdering rampage a decade earlier, the hotel decides to have Jack take the same approach toward his own family, planting the idea in his subconscious while he sleeps at his desk. But what begins as the hotel's suggestion manifests for Jack as a nightmare, horrific in its detail. Though Jack yearns to rid himself of his family, he is not a savage killer by nature, and the gruesome imagery of chopping Wendy and Danny into pieces disturbs him deeply. Having witnessed Jack's reaction to the nightmare, the Overlook recognizes that it must intensify its control over him to secure his compliance. It does so by exerting greater psychological influence through the residual echoes of bartender Lloyd and ex-caretaker Grady, two spectral puppets tasked with breaking down the last vestiges of Jack's resistance. In King's novel, Jack's battles with alcoholism are explored at length. But Kubrick strips this element down to its symbolic core, using alcohol as a metaphor for the Overlook's grip on him. The more liquor Lloyd serves to Jack, the deeper he sinks under the hotel's influence. Though the symbolism linked to Jack's alcoholism suggests that the apparitions he encounters are indeed supernatural, it doesn't necessarily mean they possess a physical presence within the Overlook, interacting with him in a tangible sense. It may instead be that both Lloyd and the alcohol exist solely within Jack's mind, projections implanted there by the hotel itself as a means of communication. This would explain why, when Wendy bursts into the gold room to tell Jack about the woman in room 237, both Lloyd and the bottles of liquor have suddenly vanished. It's entirely plausible that Kubrick intended to suggest both the supernatural and the psychological simultaneously. Evidence of this appears in a subtle yet revealing detail during the gold room sequence. When Jack sits at the bar talking with Lloyd, the framing of certain shots makes it seem as though he's looking at the bartender. Yet, based on the placement of their hands on the bar, it becomes clear that Lloyd is positioned closer to the camera than Jack, meaning Jack isn't looking up and over at Lloyd at all, but straight ahead, most likely at his own reflection in the mirror behind the bar. Mirrors appear in numerous scenes throughout Kubrick's version of The Shining, often framed in ways that suggest a deliberate narrative purpose. While their meaning can be interpreted in several ways, I view them as windows into the Overlook's newly awakened sentience, portals reflecting the darkness that dwells within the very walls of the building itself. This idea is reinforced in several key moments. In the bedroom scene, where Jack contemplates murdering his family, the camera is carefully composed. Jack sits on the right side of the frame, while his reflection occupies the left. When he raises his arm and calls Danny over, the mirrored image conveys a chilling duality, Jack beckoning his son forward, and the hotel seemingly doing the same. It is through this very mirror we first see Jack after the Torrances have been at the hotel for a month. The camera lingers on his reflection for nearly a minute and a half before cutting to Wendy, an ominous indication that the Overlook itself is watching him, sizing him up as a potential accomplice to murder. And when Danny enters room 237, the site of the hotel's initial attempt on his life, the bedroom doors he approaches are each fitted with mirrors, acting as symbolic markers of the danger that lies ahead. Similarly, the hallway outside the gold room, which Jack traverses just moments before his first encounter with Lloyd, is lined with mirrors. Each time he passes one, he experiences a sudden burst of anger, as if the hotel is administering quick, concentrated doses of aggression to prime him for his meeting with the spectral bartender. And when Jack is sitting at the bar conversing with the Overlook through the projected image of Lloyd, he is, in truth, staring into one of these mirrors, gazing directly into the soul of the hotel itself. After Wendy tells Jack about the woman in room 237, he goes to inspect the suite and finds Mary in the bathroom, alive and well. The two embrace and kiss before she transforms back into a decaying corpse, cackling with laughter as he recoils in terror. For me, this scene operates as a direct metaphor for the Overlook's grip on Jack. Mary emerges from the bathtub as a siren, youthful and alluring, a manifestation of the hotel's own seductive appeal, its grandeur enticing Jack deeper into its spell. But once he gives in to temptation, the illusion collapses. The Overlook reveals its true nature, ugly, cunning, and vile. Her laughter becomes the voice of the hotel itself, taunting Jack with the realization that he is no longer in control, that, like the lingering residuals who populate its corridors, he too has become a puppet, another instrument the Overlook can use to get what it wants. Moreover, the inclusion of the bathroom mirror makes the scene's metaphor most apparent. As previously mentioned, mirrors serve as windows into the Overlook's dark consciousness, revealing what lies beneath its polished surface. Here, that symbolism reaches its purest expression. Jack's attraction to Mary mirrors his attraction to the hotel. In the instant he sees Mary's reflection, the hotel is exposed for what it truly is, a decaying and malevolent force hiding beneath a facade of luxurious beauty. The mirror, then, is not just a reflective surface, but a moment of revelation, the Overlook showing Jack its real face and, in doing so, confirming that he is already within its grasp. When Jack returns to the Torrances' quarters and lies to Wendy about not seeing anyone in room 237, he's doing so under the hotel's influence. Because the Overlook failed in its attempt to kill Danny through Mary, it now works to cover its tracks and deflect suspicion. If Wendy's fear of a lurking stranger were to grow, she might try to leave the hotel and take Danny with her, an outcome that would deprive the Overlook of the psychic energy it needs to absorb. To prevent that, the hotel uses Jack to reassure her, making him insist that Danny must have injured himself. His lie serves a clear purpose, to keep the family exactly where the hotel wants them. It isn't until Wendy suggests they should take Danny away that Jack finally erupts with anger. In that moment, his buried resentment rises to the surface. He lashes out, accusing her of trying to sabotage his progress and destroy what little stability he's found. For Jack, leaving the hotel would mean losing everything he believes he's finally gained: a stress-free environment, a sense of dignity, and a renewed drive to write. Since discovering the scrapbook, he's become convinced that his breakthrough is imminent, that success is finally within reach, and the thought of abandoning it all makes him furious. Jack's desire to remain at the hotel mirrors the Overlook's own will to survive, their ambitions fused into a single, unyielding force. This scene also cuts to Danny lying in bed, overhearing his parents' conversation via the shine, when he suddenly envisions the Red Room door once again. Since this image represents the moment Jack will pursue his family with an axe, its reappearance here is deliberate. It surfaces precisely as Wendy tells Jack they need to take Danny away from the hotel, words that alert the Overlook that it can no longer afford to wait before launching its attack. Sensing the threat of losing its psychic conduit, the hotel must act quickly and instruct Jack to carry out its will, which it does in the very next scene. After storming out of the family's quarters, Jack is drawn by the Overlook back to the Gold Room, where the hotel confronts him about killing Wendy and Danny. And because Grady's murderous rampage serves as the model for the Overlook's method of elimination, it's only fitting that the hotel chooses to communicate through the lingering echo of Grady himself. Just as in the earlier Gold Room sequence with Lloyd, it's possible to interpret Grady and the surrounding partygoers not as literal ghosts, but as mental projections implanted in Jack's mind, visual manifestations through which the Overlook can interact with him. Supporting this reading is the subtle camera work on display during the bathroom scene, which mirrors the framing of Jack's earlier conversation with Lloyd. Grady is positioned closer to the camera than Jack, while Jack's gaze appears misaligned, not directed at Grady, but past him, toward the back wall. Given that they're standing face to face, Jack's eyes should be centered if he were actually making eye contact. Instead, his line of sight drifts to the far right, as if he's staring into one of the mirrors behind Grady. When the scene cuts to a close-up of Grady, he stands directly in front of a mirror, positioned so that he almost appears to be inside it, contained within the reflective surface, or, more precisely, within the walls of the hotel. This composition reinforces the notion that Jack isn't speaking with the long-dead caretaker at all, but with the Overlook itself, a sentient force using Grady's image as a vessel through which to issue its next command. But before Jack can carry out the Overlook's will, he must first make sure that Wendy and Danny are completely cut off from any chance of escape. He does this by disabling both the radio and the snowcat, ensuring that even if his family manages to flee his attack, they'll have no way to call for help or leave the premises. He then returns to the Colorado Lounge and waits for the moment to strike. The shot of Jack at his typewriter, which appears after Halloran's plane lands in Denver, is, in my view, the only on-screen instance where Jack is actually shown typing the phrase, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." Up to this point in the second act, Jack has been working on a genuine book about the Overlook. In King's novel, Jack arrives at the hotel midway through writing a play. He later discovers the scrapbook and becomes inspired to make the Overlook the subject of his next project. Kubrick radically changes this setup, portraying Jack as a writer without a defined project from the outset. In early drafts and deleted material, Kubrick included a scene in which the scrapbook mysteriously appears on Jack's desk. Jack leafs through its yellowed clippings, then tells Wendy he's finally found his novel, calling the scrapbook a gold mine of material that, to him, represents 20th century America. The sequence would then have cut to Jack typing enthusiastically in the lounge when Wendy interrupts him. During early script development, Kubrick and Johnson conceived a writing binge for Jack leading up to his attack on the family. A stack of pages filled with a single repeated line of gibberish. They considered various phrases including "Jack be nimble, Jack be quick," and "Jack and Jill went up the hill," before ultimately landing on the now famous "all work and no play" line. Kubrick then staged Wendy's discovery of the manuscript in a way that makes it appear as though Jack has been typing that phrase from the very beginning, an ingenious choice that amplifies the dread and madness of the moment. Yet, because Wendy turns the pages slowly, and we only glimpse the first 30-odd sheets, it's impossible to know how long Jack has actually been writing those words. Given Kubrick and Johnson's initial concept for Jack's writing binge, and the film's internal logic that the Overlook slowly tightens its grip on his mind, it stands to reason that Jack begins by working on an actual book rather than instantly falling into madness. Only in the moments preceding his attack on Wendy and Danny does he descend into the obsessive typing of the phrase. Under this reading, the line becomes Jack's declaration that the time for writing is over, that the work is done, and the play is about to begin. During their confrontation, Nicholson gives an animated, almost theatrical performance, as though Jack were under the influence of alcohol. In an early draft of the screenplay, Kubrick and Johnson had Wendy recognize this directly, having her ask Jack where he got anything to drink. But the line was dropped before filming. Jack's psychological intoxication here fits seamlessly into the film's motif of alcohol as a metaphor for his fading civility. The closer he comes to killing his family, the more visibly drunk he appears. His inhibitions have evaporated. He's free to unleash years of contempt and relish the sadistic thrill of threatening Wendy's life. At this point, the true Jack has surfaced completely, stripped of pretense, and he's savoring every second of it. By the end of the film, he's so consumed by rage that he staggers through the hedge maze as if utterly inebriated. After Wendy strikes Jack with a bat and locks him inside the pantry, the Overlook reaches out to him once more, again through the echo of Grady, using the same emotional manipulation it has relied on throughout the film. It undermines Jack's confidence by suggesting that he's weak, that he has failed in his duties, and that he has allowed his own wife to outmaneuver him. The hotel knows exactly which buttons to push: Jack's ego and deep insecurity. By targeting these vulnerabilities, the Overlook primes him with an even stronger determination to kill his family. Once Jack is fully aligned with its agenda, the hotel simply unlocks the door and sets him loose. One interesting detail in this scene is the cans of Calumet baking powder stacked directly behind Jack. Are these cans meant to be read as a symbolic nod to the Indian curse that has jinxed the Overlook? When Wendy drags Jack into the pantry, the cans aren't on the shelf, which raises the possibility that they were intentionally placed behind Jack for this moment, giving them a subtle narrative function. As mentioned earlier, during Wendy and Danny's tour of the kitchen, the pantry shelf behind Halloran contains a single Calumet can, but the shelves are arranged differently when the characters first enter the room, suggesting that the placement of the food in that scene may have been intentional. That said, Kubrick's notoriously high number of reshoots throughout production complicates any attempt to draw firm conclusions. Even a pair of continuity Polaroids from a reshoot of Danny staring at Halloran show the boxes behind him stacked differently. Since his traumatic encounter in room 237, Danny has remained in the Torrance quarters, still reeling from shock. The assault he endured, combined with his awareness of his father's impending attack, has pushed him into a dissociated state. To cope, he retreats inward, allowing Tony to move to the forefront of his consciousness. Tony effectively takes control, allowing Danny to navigate the immediate threat. This is why, when Wendy speaks to him, he responds only in Tony's voice. In King's novel, Tony is revealed to be Danny as an adult, reaching back in time to warn his younger self of the danger awaiting him at the Overlook. Whether the film intends the same, that Tony is literally Danny from the future, is irrelevant. The shine still functions as a tool Danny can use to protect himself. By letting Tony take over, he gains the ability to anticipate the exact moment his father will arrive at the Torrance quarters. This is why he retrieves the knife, to defend both himself and his mother, and why he scrawls Redrum on the door and repeats it aloud, to warn Wendy that the attack is now only moments away. While viciously axing his way through the family's quarters, Jack breaks off his pursuit of Wendy and Danny to go after Halloran, giving Wendy the chance to escape and search for her son. As she wanders the hotel's corridors, she encounters the lingering remnants of people from the Overlook's past. Unlike the apparitions Jack and Danny see during the film's second act, which can be read as psychological projections crafted by the hotel, the spirits Wendy encounters are likely capable of taking on an actual physical presence. By this point, the Overlook has been steadily feeding on Danny's shine since his arrival, and has finally accumulated enough strength to fully manifest its supernatural energy to make itself truly come alive. This may also explain why Danny was able to escape the clutches of Mary in room 237 earlier in the film. The hotel simply didn't yet have the strength to maintain a physical form long enough to strangle him to death. Even Stephen King's 1997 Shining miniseries portrays the ghosts in this way. During the boiler room climax, the spirit of Grady tries to stop Jack from increasing the boiler's pressure, but can't yet grab hold of him. Then, moments later, the hotel gains more power, and he's suddenly able to push Jack aside and seize the valve wheel. The apparitions Wendy encounters while searching for Danny are directly linked to the ballroom photograph that concludes the film, a final image that, in turn, echoes a key narrative element from King's novel. The partygoer in the corridor, the skeletons in the lobby, And even the two men in the upstairs suite can all be seen as participants in a perpetual 4th of July celebration from 1921, the same event that unfolds in the Gold Room when Jack meets Grady. In King's novel, this gathering is a grand masquerade ball held in 1945 to mark the Overlook's reopening under its then-owner, Horace Derwent. Modeled after Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, the event carries significant thematic weight, highlighting the hotel's violent history. Poe's tale centers on a group of nobles, led by Prince Prospero, who barricade themselves inside a lavish abbey to escape the Red Death, a gruesome plague ravaging the land. Their goal is to enjoy luxury and security until it is safe to return to the outside world. Months into their confinement, Prospero hosts an extravagant masquerade ball, instructing that all guests must unmask at midnight. 7 rooms are prepared for the event, each decorated in a distinct color, with the 7th chamber draped in black and illuminated by a deep, blood-red glow. Throughout the night, a great ebony clock tolls each hour, its chimes repeatedly interrupting the dancers' revelry. When the clock strikes midnight, the guests notice a mysterious figure clad in blood-stained garments and wearing a corpse-like mask. They pursue the intruder into the 7th room and attempt to unmask him, only to find that no one is beneath the costume. The figure is the Red Death itself. One by one, the guests collapse, struck by the very plague they believed they could escape. In King's novel, the Overlook functions as a parallel to Poe's Abbey, with its long history of violence, the very evil that becomes sentient through Danny's shine, mirroring the plague of the Red Death. The 1945 masquerade ball is trapped in an endless loop within the hotel's walls, a kind of eternal realm, a perpetual celebration of death into which every victim of the Overlook is absorbed. When the hotel introduces itself to Jack by leaving the scrapbook in the basement, he opens it to find one of the original invitations from the ball, the Overlook's way of inviting him to join the macabre celebration and participate in its killings. King also brings Poe's clock into the story, having Danny insert a key and wind it, an action that symbolizes the Overlook, charging itself through his powerful shine. In a thematic sense, the clock becomes a countdown to midnight, the moment when the Red Death unmasks and Jack Torrance moves to murder his family. Although Kubrick replaces the masquerade ball from the novel with a 4th of July celebration, the thematic message behind Poe's story still resonates. Like the nobles who barricade themselves inside Prospero's Abbey, Jack Torrance retreats from the plague of his dissatisfying life by hiding within an extravagant hotel, wrapped in a veneer of wealth, luxury, and prestige. The Overlook becomes his abbey, a place that offers the illusion of success, and when the midnight hour arrives, the plague claims his life, just as it does the revelers in The Masque of the Red Death. Even the apparitions the Torrances encounter can be understood as masks the Overlook wears to manipulate and weaken its victims, lingering impressions of former guests that the Red Death can inhabit until the moment of unmasking. This is why the residuals Wendy sees near the end are all partygoers. The ball is already underway, and the midnight hour is fast approaching. The 2 men in the room upstairs come directly from King's novel, Horace Derwent, a former owner of the hotel, and Roger, his lover. In the book, Roger appears in a dog costume during the 1945 masquerade ball, and Kubrick faithfully preserves that imagery. Even the skeletons in the lobby seem to be celebrating, champagne and cocktails in hand, served by what appears to be Delbert Grady. Originally, Kubrick had intended for the ball to remain a masquerade party. In an early 1978 draft of the screenplay, Jack finds an invitation to the masked ball tucked inside the scrapbook. And a revised treatment from November of '77 even includes the ballroom bandleader announcing that the stroke of midnight has arrived and that it's time for the guests to unmask. In my view, Kubrick ultimately shifted the event to an Independence Day celebration to deepen the film's underlying motif of the Native American curse. Just as the Overlook is built atop the sacred grounds of a native burial site, America itself was built on land taken from indigenous peoples. And because Kubrick wanted the source of the Red Death to stem from the curse, it becomes thematically fitting that the socialites who perished at the Overlook exist in a realm modeled after a 4th of July celebration. Another image that serves as a powerful metaphorical depiction of the Red Death is the iconic elevator of blood sequence. As Jack's descent into violence reaches its peak, the elevator doors open, unleashing a torrent of crimson that floods the Overlook's corridors. This moment parallels the sudden and unstoppable arrival of the plague in Poe's story, in which the disease cannot be contained and sweeps through Prospero's Abbey with fatal inevitability. Just as the revelers are confronted with the horrifying figure behind the corpse mask, the opening of the elevator doors functions as a symbolic unmasking. The hotel reveals its true nature, exposing its latent, murderous force in the form of the Red Deluge. The blood does not merely reflect Jack's rampage, it represents the Overlook itself, fully unleashing its power, pouring through the halls indiscriminately and striking at every inhabitant in its path. In this sense, Kubrick transforms the literal image of the elevator into a striking symbol for the thematic legacy of Poe's tale. There is one small detail I wish had been altered during the film's climax, which concerns the double-sided clock located in the service hallway. When Danny hides in the metal cabinet after escaping through the bathroom window, the clock reads 5:15, indicating that Jack's murderous rampage begins around 5 a.m. And later, when Jack pursues Danny down the same hallway several minutes afterward, the clock reads 5:25, showing that continuity was carefully considered and that the filmmakers intended the attack to occur in the early morning hours. That said, it would have been a nice touch if the hour hand were on 12 instead of 5, further reinforcing the film's symbolic connection to Poe's mask of the Red Death. This brings us to the film's final image, a black and white photograph of the Overlook's July 4th ball in 1921, with Jack positioned front and center. In his interview with Michel Simon, Kubrick explained that the photograph is meant to suggest the reincarnation of Jack. On the surface, paired with Grady's claim that Jack has always been the caretaker, it's easy to interpret the Jack we follow throughout the film as the reincarnation of a man who lived in the 1920s. But I see it the other way around. The Jack in the photograph is the one who represents the reincarnated form, the next iteration of the man we've been watching unravel. Kubrick and Johnson's first full-length treatment from August of '77 offers an intriguing glimpse into how this idea evolved. That early outline for the script ends with all four characters, Jack, Wendy, Danny, and Halloran, dead, followed by a final image described as a photograph in motion of the Torrance family dining in a ballroom full of guests. The camera would then circle to Ullman arriving with a new manager, discussing the job, before moving behind him to reveal that the ballroom is, in fact, empty. The outline never specifies the time period of this phantom ballroom, but if the Torrances were meant to be dining in the present day, the concept of reincarnation wouldn't apply to the closing image at all. And if they were seated in a ballroom from decades earlier, the implication would be that all three of the Torrances are reincarnated souls, a notion that makes even less sense than Jack alone being a reincarnation. After Kubrick decided that Wendy and Danny would survive, the final image was revised to a photograph of Jack alone, originally appearing in the scrapbook. And, when the scrapbook scenes were ultimately cut from the film, the photograph was simply relocated to the wall outside the lobby. It's also worth noting that Grady's line to Jack, "You've always been the caretaker," is lifted directly from King's novel, and in context functions as deliberate manipulation. The hotel, speaking through Grady, is actively trying to disorient Jack, telling him whatever it must in order to draw him fully into its service. And it's immediately after delivering this line that Grady begins pressuring Jack outright. In that sense, his words are unreliable, making them a shaky foundation for any literal reading of reincarnation. By contrast, the film's final photograph becomes a far cleaner and more pointed expression of fate. Throughout the story, Jack imagines the Overlook as a kind of exclusive club, a sanctuary for the socially elevated. He longs to be counted among them, to be seen as someone who belongs in their world, rather than in the ordinary, frustrating life he feels chained to. The hotel preys on that longing, and because Jack dies on its grounds, the Overlook finally absorbs him, assigning him a permanent place within its history, sealing him inside its eternal ballroom of privilege and self-delusion. In the photograph, Jack stands among the hotel's socialites as one more doomed reveler who has fallen into the same trap they once did. His smile belongs to a man who has been swallowed completely, a man who now fits effortlessly into the world he once idealized. For Jack, this is the culmination of his destiny, the place where he was always headed, and he could not be happier to have finally arrived.